Peyton's message, the cost of contamination. And when I say contamination, it's kind of a hot topic word. If we just think a short time ago, there was all over the news the water problem in Flint, right? Contaminated water. I was looking at some surveys this week, and it spoke to some interesting thoughts that people have in regards to their trust for water. And so I want to do a quick survey here. Please participate if you can. By a show of hands, I want to see if you trust your tap water or your bottled water from Kroger or wherever you buy your bottled water more. So if you trust your tap water more than the bottled water, would you raise your hand? Okay. If you trust the bottled water you buy, raise your hand. Okay, we are not normal by the national standards. We all knew that, right? Well, we do. Nationally, according to a lot of surveys, many Americans are actually shifting to some surveys showing that more Americans trust bottled water over the tap water. Now, that's an interesting thing because it comes down to what can be in it. And it's funny because as we look at these bottles of water, it's really ridiculous. I looked it up this morning, just, where these things are made is really, we get these really misleading names. Arctic Spring Water is from Florida. Everest comes from Texas. Glacier Mountain. You guys are never going to drink this again. It's from Ohio. And New Jersey. And Yosemite comes from Los Angeles. And what is it, Nestle that's in Michigan? And so, yeah, they come from all over. Oftentimes, bottled water, I know, I think it's Jay Tinker has told me he doesn't like the bottled water if it's just plain bottled water. It's got to be the natural spring water. Because if it doesn't say spring water on it, guess what it is? It's municipal tap water that they filtered again. And so it's interesting that we have this fascination, and it's growing, and it's becoming more popular, and people pay a ridiculous amount of money because some of it's really a perception of what's safe and not safe. One of the interesting things that we see, we've moved out into the country, and we offer people water. We have well water. It tastes like iron. And it's interesting to see some people are like, no, thank you. Some people are like, yes, I've missed this. But there's perceptions about what is good and not good. And we recognize that it doesn't take much. If I were to stand up here and read a report to you that they had found, let's say, fecal matter in the Detroit tap water, you probably would not hit the fountain on the way out. Right? Guess what? That's one of the things they regularly find in tap water and bottled water. Is fecal matter, bugs, crickets, pesticides, fertilizers, and then there's there's thresholds of what's allowable and not allowable. So when you take a drink out in the drinking fountain out there, just remember that. Now, nobody's going to want to drink of water the rest of the weekend. But we recognize because we know there's something in us that knows we want it to be pure. We know it's supposed to be just water, right? We don't want other stuff in it. And we don't want the neighbor who flushed his blood pressure medicine down the toilet and now it's trickled back into the water. We don't want that. We don't want, one of the things we had to watch in Ohio, we had to test our water. We had a very shallow well, and we were surrounded by fields. So we had our water tested because we didn't want fertilizer in our water, right? And these are things you have to think about. But it's amazing when it comes to other things how okay we are with contamination. We're going to look in Nehemiah 13 this morning at a bit of a contamination issue. Now, I need to explain some things. I had kind of tagged on the last part of 12 as far as last week's message, but it really ties in well with the front part of 13. I'll remind you at the end of 12, it talked about this joy that the people had in the priests and the work that they were doing, and they were giving their tithes and their portions and their offerings. If you're trying to follow along, the Bible app is not up today. I'm sorry if that threw your groove off. We're going to be just in the good old paper copy or your phone. But at the end of 12, we see that. And in the beginning of 13, we see some other reforms starting to take root in Nehemiah's Jerusalem. It tells us in chapter 13, starting in verse 1, on that day they read from the book of Moses. Now, what day? We don't know. This is just a day. As far as we can tell, this is just another random one of their days of just gathering like we do every week, and they're reading from the Word. And they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them, yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. Now that's a reference to a story found back in Numbers 22, 23, 24 in there, whereas Israel was coming out of Egypt and they're kind of moving into this area, there's a couple people groups that did not welcome them well, and in these particular ones, they actually hired or tried to hire a prophet of God to come and curse God's people. Now, it's an interesting story. If you flip back to Numbers 22, we see that Balaam didn't really want to. He inquired of the Lord. The Lord told him no. And so the first delegation, this king sends this delegation with money and good loot and says, hey, we want you to come. We know that who you bless is blessed and who you curse is cursed. They acknowledge the power. They don't acknowledge where the power came from. And so we see them, they're like, hey, here's some money. Come curse this people that's moved into our area. Balaam goes and inquires of the Lord, comes back and says, no. So the next time they send more important people. So the first time he sent like some dignitaries. The next time he sent like the princes with more money. We know that who you curse is cursed, who you bless is blessed. Come curse his people. And we see that he has a conversation with the Lord, and it seems that he starts to go with them. And then we have the whole story of Balaam's donkey. And that's one of the most fascinating stories in the Old Testament, where the angel of the Lord is standing in the way, and we see Balaam beating this animal, and God opens the mouth of the donkey, and it rebukes its master. And that should give all of us great hope, because if the Lord can speak through a donkey, he can speak through any of us. You can all draw your own conclusions about the guy that's talking in front of you right now. But what we see here is eventually Balaam comes and he inquires of the Lord, and what he speaks over Israel is blessing. And he does it again, and he does it a third time. And so what God is referring to here is that, or in what we see in Nehemiah. Now that kind of points us to something. It tells us they obeyed. In verse 3 it says, as soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. They listened at this point. But it points us to something. God, when he gives us rules and regulations in his holy word, ways of living, ways to be holy before him, there's a good reason for the things he gives us. Now, someone could look at those laws and say, you know what? Why are we got to separate them? Well, Nehemiah clearly tells us because they went so far as to trying to hire a prophet to curse God's people. And so God says, no, they cannot be a part of the assembly. Now it's interesting. Verse 4 says, now before this. Now what are we talking about before? Before they acted in obedience right here and separating out the people, and before the tail end of chapter 12, where they were giving what they were supposed to give to the temple, not only the sacrifices, but the portions and things. Before all of that, there was this situation that arose. Now, what we see here is at some point, we don't know where, we don't know how long. There's no indication in the text. Nehemiah gets called back to the capital and back to the king's service. Now, I want to remind you, back at the beginning, we know Nehemiah was cupbearer to the king, so he's this intimate guy with the king, and he had asked permission to go. And it tells us that Nehemiah gave him a plan, like, hey, I'm going to come back. And so sometime in here, he has gone back now to Susa, and he's gone back to the capital, to the king's service, and he's not present. Now, there's an old saying, when the cat's away, The mice will play. I'm going to be gone in another week for 2 weeks. I hope when the pastor's away, the congregants don't play too much. You have to behave yourselves, and please listen to Mark and Brian as they share. But what we have is Nehemiah's gone. It says, before this, Elisha, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah. You guys remember Tobiah? He's like the idiot of the story. He's the archenemy. He has been stirring up trouble for Nehemiah from day one. He is kind of like, he's like half Jewish. He's kind of a mixed descent guy, and he's tried intimidation. He's tried to start like a small militia to stop Nehemiah. He threatened to send letters to the king saying Nehemiah was revolting. He has done a lot of bad stuff. This dude is evil. He is poisonous, and he is downright unhealthy to be around. He's in leadership, and he shouldn't be. Now, I'm sure, if your work, if I said, can you think of that person that just poisons the work atmosphere? Many of you can be like, yeah. You want his name or her name? Yeah, you can give me the department and everything, right? We've all experienced it. There are people that come into our lives that seem to poison everything they touch. They bring a bad spirit about them, and they cause division, and they cause trouble, and they like to pit people against each other, and it seems like they're always up to no good. That's Tobiah. And what do we see? Elisha, he's related. So, we have this thing, and we still do this, right? Family's family. We stick with them. We deal with them. We have poisonous family members. We see that Elisha prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. So in the temple, they showed a little bit of a picture in that video there. And so there we had the Holy of Holies and in the holy area. And then kind of around the outskirts of that, inside the courts, there was these big chambers. Because in their day, when they brought their tithes, they literally brought, tithes of what they've given. There are actually people in our church that do that. There's a member of our church that every year they bring Wendy and I a tithe, the first fruits of their strawberries. And it's really a treat. And we appreciate that greatly. Hint, no. But what we see is that's what they did, right? Most of us don't go out and raise crops and animals. Well, most of you. Wendy and I are kind of working on that right now. But, so your first fruits are probably just financial, right? Your job doesn't send you home with food and grain and stuff. They send you home with money. And so when we talk about tithing at church, we talk about tithing money. In Israel's day, listen, when they gathered in their crops, their first fruits was to bring the crops. And it was a really practical thing because it came in to the temple for those in service in the temple. There is scriptural precedence throughout this book for taking care of those who serve you. Wendy and I gladly do it, and we're thankful for what you provide, but there is precedence. I've had people argue with me that I shouldn't be paid as a pastor. And, that this is, of course, there's also people that think I work only one day a week, and we all, and you all, half of you have joked about that, for the record, but it's not, that's so far from the truth. But the reality is there's scriptural precedence here, and there were kind of two types of offerings that came in. People brought their sacrifices, right? And so they had to bring in their animals and the sacrifices that would be burned. And there were provisions in the law for how the priests would be provided for that. We were joking about this. We're looking at during the week of EBS having an outdoor service that Sunday, and we're talking about like pig roast and all kinds of stuff. And Jay and I were actually talking about that. The priests, they kind of stick their fork in the soup pot, right? And they pull out whatever. That's their portion. So that came from the sacrifices. And so Jay offered that I could do that with a pig, and I said, you haven't seen my fork yet. It's a pitchfork. I got the whole ham. All right. But what we see here is that in Scripture, the priests, those who ministered in the sacrifices, were taken care of through the sacrifices. That's how they were provided. Now, the other Levites, the singers, the worship team, the other people that served in the temple service, they were taken care of out of the tithes as people brought the first fruits of their grain and the various things. And what we're going to see here in a moment is that had ceased to exist. So there's these storehouses, these rooms, big rooms, nice rooms, in the temple, in the house of God, for the storage of these things for the Levites to live off of. And in that place, they made Tobiah an apartment. How nice of them. Now, I guess I can't say too much. There was a point where some of you saw I had sort of a quasi-apartment going on in my office because I didn't have a house. But this is what they did. And so that they've literally made him an apartment. And it's where the stuff usually go. While this was taking place, it says, Nehemiah says, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Elisha had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now I'm going to skip down to verse 10. He says, I also found out that the portions of the Levites have not been given to them. Let me tell you a truth about the human condition. We have a tendency to constantly want to put things in places reserved for God's use that are not of God. We have sin issues that well up in our heart, and they will take up residence in our hearts and take a place of things that belong to God. So do you see the correlation? They make him an apartment. At the same time, they stop giving the stuff that's supposed to go in that room in the first place. Over a family relationship, this evil guy is given precedence over the tithes and offerings that supplies the needs of people who are faithfully serving God's people. That is screwed up. That's screwed up. Now, it tells us Nehemiah's reaction. I love Nehemiah's reaction. It says, I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Do you picture that? He went rolling in there, and I don't think it was gently bringing his chair out and setting it down. No, I think he's like growing up, grabbing stuff and just like, whoo, out it goes, right? Breaking it. He doesn't care. This is an area reserved for the tithes and offerings of God's people. This is for God. And this man has taken up residence in a place reserved for God's work. He throws them out. Then he says, I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. Verse 10, I also found out the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. Do you see what's happening? God's people weren't providing for them, so they had to go get a job. And so I confronted the officials. He says, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. I love the authority and the way Nehemiah just says, you know what? This stops here. We're going to fix it now. Then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and their assistant Hanan, the son of Zaccur, son of Mattaniah. For they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Scriptural precedence right there for the office of treasurer, assistant treasurer. We have people here that serve faithfully and do that when you give, they're back there right now counting and getting all that straight, and they put things in the right funds. They make sure that Sarah and I get paid, and Jane, and we appreciate their work. At the end of this, we see again this comment from Nehemiah. Remember me, O my God, concerning this. Do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. Do you understand where the passion Nehemiah has here? He is first and foremost concerned is that God's people are honoring God by honoring his house and by following in obedience. He understands that to dishonor those that are serving and not provide is a dishonor to God. He understands that allowing some dude to take up residence in the temple, I mean, that just doesn't, the priest didn't even live in there. It's a storehouse. But and he realized this is a desecration to God's name. This is a sin against the name of God because it is contamination within the temple. Do you notice that he needed to purify it? The video talked about this need with holiness, so we have to bring about a purification. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 to 16, Peter tells us, therefore, preparing your minds for action, being sober-minded, set your hope fully in the grace that would be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he has called you as holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. We must recognize, last week we talked about the need for a holy roar and for worship. And I know that's as we gather together today, and half our people are on family things and stuff, and some people maybe are sleeping because they're tired from the wedding last night. That may be difficult, but the reality is it's not just that. We are called to worship in a way that the next generation remembers our passion for Jesus. But we are also called to live holy lives so that worship flows out of that. And I think there's two ways that the enemy likes to wriggle his way in and take away our holiness. One of them is very clear in this passage in Nehemiah. We see it is simply a person. Can we be frank that there are people that we sometimes allow in our lives that honestly drag us further and further and further away from Jesus? Tobiah had set himself against every movement God was doing in Jerusalem. He constantly pulled the people away from God's will, constantly pulled them away from the leadership that God had anointed, and was pushing for something else. Sometimes those people we must step back from, that we do not continue to be dragged away from Jesus Christ. I know that's hard. And we are called to be witnesses. We're called to be in this world, but not of it. But the reality is, listen, friend, if you cannot hold your ground with Jesus as you engage in the friendship or relationship you have with this other person, if you are being dragged away, I'm telling you, you have to break that off. And for some people, it varies. You're depending on your person. Like some people, you can be around this guy that struggles with this sin and it doesn't really bother you, but you go over here and man, this thing, it pulls you. I know one of the things that I used to struggle with when I worked at the prison, I was around guys that is like every third word, sometimes word 2.5, you know what I mean, was a cuss word. That began to just infiltrate me. And Wendy can give testimony. I'd be talking, I'd get heated about something, stuff would come out, and I'd be, whoo. That's a struggle I have. And so I know I cannot be around someone. If I'm trying to work with someone and they just constantly are the person that swears. Now, I mean, I am around some people sometimes. I mean, there's a guy I know that one day I heard, I have never heard a string of cuss words put together quite so eloquently. But I say a string. Like one merged into the other one. And I'm like, wow, that's kind of impressive. I didn't know those could all blend together that nicely. But the reality is I can't be around it every day because I know that this is an area that will start to infiltrate me and start to pull me away from God. Now, there are other things like, I know there's people that struggle. You can't be around alcohol. I've never really drank alcohol. I'm allowed now as a pastor technically, but I don't. So it's not a struggle. So I could be around a guy that's drinking and it doesn't bother me a bit. It's not a struggle for me. Every one of us knows that, but the truth is you know those triggers. And there's times when you need to say no, to back off. Because your holiness is of utmost importance to the Lord God. Just like we don't want a little contamination, God's presence is so intense that if we bring any contamination into our lives, we're starting to bring junk into our hearts. It keeps us at a further distance from God. Now, I think that's one way. The other way he does it is simply just send things that take up residence in our heart. And I think it's just like that. It can seem as innocent as a dude, well, he's a relative, the guy's in charge of the storehouse is my relative, man, he needs a place to stay. And it can seem really innocent, but the reality is when it comes to the chambers of our hearts, we can put things there totally innocently, totally thinking this is okay, and we immediately push out the stuff of God. It could be a person. You could have such a fascination with a person that it's just like, that takes up residence, and next thing you know, God's losing his place. It could be a particular struggle with a sin. It could be a particular hobby that maybe it's more than a hobby to you. Wendy and I have done some peacemaking training this year, and one of the things they talk about, that a lot of conflict happens when people take something that a need, or not a need, or a want, a desire they have, and when it crosses a threshold where they're willing to sin to fulfill that want, we call that idolatry. And that's a lot of times where major conflict, especially in the church, happens. Where a basic desire or want that maybe isn't evil in itself, when it begins to take the place where we're willing to sin to obtain it, whether bad-mouthing somebody or hating a brother or whatever it is, that becomes this idol, and now we are in sin. And this is the other way that Satan gets in, is the reality is Satan doesn't do a frontal attack. He doesn't come at you trying to take every storehouse in the temple of your heart. He wants to find one little room to take up residence, and from there he will poison the rest of your life. Because as soon as he has residence, as soon as he has that one room in your heart with that sin issue, now all of a sudden the presence of God is too intense. And maybe I was here, but now I got to back up because that thing's burning. So I either got to get rid of that to move closer, or if I'm keeping it, it pushes me away from God. Many people have asked, with the changing culture, I don't know how many times I've been asked in the last couple of years, can you be a homosexual and a Christian? I think you can. But the reality is it's just like any other sin that lodges in your heart. You can't get but so close to God before you either have to deal with it or you're just pushing away. Any sin. That could be a struggle with homosexuality. That could be a struggle with alcoholism. That could be a struggle with pornography. Any struggle you name, if you allow it to take up residence, it's pushing you back. Or any really good thing. I mean, family relationships, that's really good, right? I mean, we should care about our relatives, especially the ones that are unsaved, right? But the reality, if that person takes up a residence to the point that they were sinning, they were not giving to God's house what was due, commanded, if it takes up that residence, it pushes us away from God, and there's only one thing you can do. If it's a sin issue in your heart, you have to, with God's help, you have to do a Nehemiah. You got to grab the couch and the TV and the end table and the refrigerator and everything else that's taking up residence in that apartment, and you need to throw it out with everything you got. And I say all that because the reality is wasn't just Tobiah, right? All his stuff's in there. A lot of times we can struggle with a certain issue. And man, like, okay, well, I'll take this thing and I'll get rid of it. But the reality is all the peripheral stuff's still there. I don't know how many times I've counseled guys in pornography that, you know what? I'm going to put a filter on my computer. Problem solved. It's like throwing Tobiah out but keeping all the equipment there. Because if that sin's still taking up residence in your house, guess what? You're going to find a way. And I really love, I met one guy in particular. He was a computer tech guy. He's like, you know how to get around that. But the reality is we want to take this little thing because the reality is we don't want to clean that room and give it the proper housing that it deserves. We don't want to give God residence in that place. And what we see in Nehemiah is this call. Throw it out. And if it's a person and you really sincerely feel you're called to love them, you may have to love them at an arm's length. If it's a family member like Tobiah, I don't think it was wrong for the priest to love on Tobiah, but he should have loved him at an arm's length, not giving him residence in the house of God. I hope you take that to heart this morning, our call to live holy lives as we're also called to worship our holy God. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up as I